You're listening to episode 289 of the Master Your Mind, Business, and Life podcast. A simple life has been calling to me more and more. Maybe it was a shift when I moved to the grounding energies of the mountains, or maybe it was my conversation with this week's guest. Living in only 150 square feet for years, Ryan Mitchell has learned a thing or two about living simply. From downsizing to life simplification and designing a life that's right for you, Ryan brings a lot of experience and practical knowledge to the table. He built his own tiny house in 2012, learning as he went along, which inspired him to help others in their journey to live small. Today, he still lives in this tiny house full-time and off-grid with solar, teaching others how to live simply. Ryan and I are talking everything from his journey to how you can simplify your life and also designing and building a better life and more. This week's episode is brought to you by Spiritually Seeking. When you visit spiritually-seeking.com and enter the promo code podcast at checkout, you can save 20% on items such as card readings, life guidance sessions, and numerology reports, and more. Simply enter the promo code podcast at checkout to save. Okay, are you ready to meet Ryan? You know what to do. Tune in, turn it up, let's go.
You're listening to Master Your Mind, Business and Life. Conversations with everyday world shifters, truth seekers, and rule breakers. Here's your host, Lauren Smith.
Hey Ryan, welcome to the show. I'm pumped to have you join me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ryan, I feel like you have so much to bring to the table today, and I know I have an abundant amount of questions, but before we dive into those, let's start here. What is the story behind the shift into a tiny home? What made you lean into the style of living?
So kind of my origin story with all of this is back in 2009, I was coming out of graduate school and landed what I thought was like my first, career adult job. And of course, everyone knows now, but we didn't know at the time that the Great Recession was, kicking off in full steam there. Yeah. And so I was basically right out of the gate and the company closed. Ooh. And so here I was thinking I was starting a career and I had this major false start. Of course, this is the story of so many other people. People were losing their jobs, losing their homes, things like that. And it was just a very big wake up for me in my life. And what I think it made me realize was that we were kind of sold this narrative, if you will, that you go to school, get good grades, you get a degree, and then you use that degree to go get a job. Mm-hmm. And if you're smart and you work hard, you'll have job security. And pretty much right out the door, we realized that maybe that's not the world we live in anymore.
Yeah.
So that's when I started really like questioning a lot of things, asking some tough questions. And I remember looking at my budget and saying, okay, about half my income is going towards housing between rent, utilities, any like little maintenance things, insurance, all that kind of stuff added up. It was about 50% at that time. And I asked myself kind of a crazy question. I was like, if I could just remove this line item, figure out some way that it was basically down to zero, that would be huge in terms of my financial security, my peace of mind, the trajectory of my life, financial health, all those things. And I had no idea how I was going to do it. And eventually I stumbled along a picture of this little house built on a trailer. And I didn't have any information about it, but it was enough of an idea to pick up and run with. And then a couple of years later, I started actually building my own tiny house. And so my living expenses of, rent and all that kind of stuff went from $1,500 a month down to $15 a month.
Whoa.
And
talk about a shift.
Yeah, right. Like I could go work, it depends on the job, only like a few minutes in some cases or an hour, yeah. Right. And earn that for the whole month. So it dramatically changed what my financial picture looked like. And that enabled me to do things like, go out on my own, become self-employed, start, kind of my entrepreneurial journey, travel the world, do all these things. And, it was a wild ride from that point on.
Wow. I love that you first questioned the narrative that was fed to you almost as like your first step. I think
Mhm.
that that step of like realization and kind of, like, I mean, I'm a product of that too. You go to college. Like, I think that was really just drilled into us. It was like college, 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 succeed. And now as
Right.
a parent, I'm like telling my kids, I'm like, you don't really need college to succeed. I'm like, I mean, you really don't, unless you're going to be a doctor or have this specialty
Right.
that requires a degree, you don't really need it. And there's so much that you can just learn. So I love that you started with questioning that narrative, but I'm really curious as to why you decided to build your own tiny house, which I think is crazy impressive, but you could have gone other ways. You could have already built one that was, like already done for you, or even worked with a tiny home fabricator. What made you go this route instead?
Yeah. So I think, kind of to contextualize this was pretty early on in tiny houses. So there really weren't any builders.
Hmm.
There weren't even really any websites or information out there. And that's kind of how I got started with mine. Was I was having to figure out all this stuff. And then I was like, well, obviously I'm not the only one thinking about this. So maybe I should share what I figured out. And that's kind of what started the website, frankly, by accident, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I put it up there, but I didn't think it was going to get as popular as it did. And people really resonated with it because they were interested and also doing it at the same time. So there wasn't builders, there wasn't a lot of information. And then the other part of this is whenever, and this is with a traditional home or a tiny home, about 50% of the cost is wrapped up in labor. And so another way to think about that is a house will cost half the price if you're able to do it yourself.
Mm.
So a tiny house was on a scale that was somewhat approachable. I mean, it was a huge task. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, but it was at least somewhat approachable. And just to kind of give people background, I have no building experience prior to building my tiny house. I was an HR guy. I worked white collar in an office. And then on weekends and nights, I was putting on a tool belt, picking up a hammer and going at it. So I had to learn all from scratch, but it meant that my house was basically half the cost, which made the ROI on the whole endeavor much quicker.
How long did it take you to build it from start to finish?
On the calendar, it was about a year and a half. 3 to 4 months of that was waiting on, there was like a backlog on like my windows. So I was like in
Uh,
a holding pattern for the windows. So I think all told, a year of weekends mainly is
yeah.
is kind of what it took.
When you look back to 2012 and the midst of building, is there anything that you would have done differently to either ease the process or maybe now that you've lived in it for a while, any reconfiguration of design that maybe would make your life, I don't know, I was better or like more enhanced in a way?
Mhm. Um, I think when I was building, all the tiny houses were very small. I mean, they're small to begin with, but
Yeah.
now like you're seeing larger tiny homes. So my tiny house is about 20 feet long. Now it's very common to see like 30 feet long. So I don't know that I would want a 30-foot tiny house, but I think maybe like a 24-foot might have been really nice. And I think the big thing there is I would try to get my bed on the ground floor, because right now my bed room is basically a little loft in the house that I go up into at night. And that works. But it would also be really convenient just to be, on the ground floor. You just kind of flop into it and not have
Yeah.
to come down a ladder in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I can imagine how that could just kind of get old, but you're like, okay, this is how it was built. I like this like whole process though, but it feels like to me a lot in the beginning. How did you kind of gauge what goes into a tiny house and what doesn't? And then how do you stay on track with
Mhm.
living more a simplified life?
Yeah. So I think, well, I mean, I'll give the average kind of like big goal advice is you look at the larger goal, you break it down to smaller pieces, and you focus on what's in front of you. Um, and I think that's helpful to a point, but I think also you need to get really clear on why you're doing it, and then also what you're willing to give up to achieve it. And I think those two things are important, because I knew that if I was able to complete the house, then like it would be a game changer, right? Because I mean, you could either look at it like I'm regaining half my income, or it's almost like on a quality of life, like you're doubling your income. Two different ways to look at it. So there was that. And I just knew that that would facilitate so many things. And I had a pretty clear vision of what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be tied in an office. I wanted to be able to earn a living wherever and do the work whenever, whether that was for myself or for someone else. And then I think what I was willing to give up was obviously like the weekends and things like that when I was building it. And then just having to get over all the consumerist mentalities, kind of your attachment to possessions and in mass. Like I obviously still have things and whatnot. And then really trying to mentally separate your worth as a human being from the common like status symbols. So typically, someone who's successful is seen to live in a big house with a nice car. They're married, 2.5 kids. They have a prestigious career that they're climbing the corporate ladder. And I think the Great Recession, woke me up to like, hey, we're in a new paradigm. Yeah. So I think that was a little bit easier. And I just kind of said like, okay, what is the traditional narrative or path going to cost me? What's the price you're going to pay for those things? And I just decided I wasn't really willing to pay that price of, go into a corporate cubicle for the next 30, 40 years, and then maybe retire at 65 or 70. I just wasn't willing to do that. And so I knew I had to make sacrifices. So that's kind of what sustained me through the whole thing.
I think that's really important to address the mindset of it all. Do you think that when, we're living these like big lavish lifestyles and trying to live up to societal norms, right? Mm-hmm. For maybe subconscious reasons, do you think that we're actually living in more of a scarcity mindset because of that? Like I have to hoard 27 jackets because one day I might not have one. Or do you think there's a lot of scarcity in the way that society lives right now?
I mean, I think a lot of it's manufactured scarcity mindset, right? We live in a world where companies like to market, basically manufactured kind of perceptions. And so we think that we need these things. And if we're not intentional with our life, how we want to live it, the choices that we make within it, then and define what we want out of it, then a corporation's happy to do that for us. And they're going to do it to their benefit. And I think it's important for us to be intentional with how we live, so that we can define it in a way that's beneficial or most beneficial to ourselves and the people that matter to us.
Oh, I love that part of being intentional with our lives. What are the first steps of someone that they should take to design and build a better life with more intention?
Mm-hmm. So it's a tricky thing because you first want to figure out like what is right for you and where you want to go. And that gets that's a tangled web because of all these messages from society of like what success is, what it means to be a productive person, all the consumerist things in there. And it's not that things are bad or that having a nice home is bad. It's just that someone else has made that definition, and it may not align with some of our values. And so it's crazy how deep the claws are of those societal pressures, because even today I catch myself like getting hung up on some of these things. About 2-3 years ago, I did an experiment where, other than like basically groceries and like consumables like your toilet paper, things like that, I didn't buy anything for an entire year. And what I did was I kept a list of the things that I did want to buy, but I said, okay, I'm not buying things this year. And it was, and to put this in context, I had been living in a tiny house, and, you could call me a minimalist for probably 7-8 years at that point.
Yeah.
And I still was like catching myself wanting these things. And so I wrote them down. At the end of the year, I looked at the list. It had 13 items on it. And out of those 13 items, which I think the average person would have a much longer list.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm like, my gosh, like that'd be like 13 for me in a week sometimes.
Yeah.
I was like, 13. Geez, Ryan. Okay, but continue. 13 items.
Yeah. So 13 items. And then what I realized was, like, out of those 13 items, there was only one at the end of the year that I still actually wanted. And so that meant 12 things were basically kind of fleeting temptations. I don't want to call it temptations, but that's not a great word, but like almost like an impulse buy kind of thing. Yeah. And I tried to examine what drove those things. And I mean, some of them were fine, like fine. And it's not like, again, none of these things are bad. But ultimately what I realized was, like, they weren't going to do what I hoped they would do. Usually when you buy something, you're trying to solve a problem, fill a need, feel a certain way, like be seen as someone as in a certain lifestyle or whatever the thing is. And I realized that none of those things would actually achieve what I was hoping to. It was just a company basically, selling on the emotional lever that people had to fulfill whatever the problem was in their life. And so, those 12 things, it was just a very sobering experience for me to realize, like, hey, there's these things that if I wasn't intentional, I would have kind of fell into those pits. And so it's a crazy how just the marketing and consumers' tendencies and just our society in general has this influence over us. So we need to be able to recognize that first. And I think that's important. And then from there, it's okay, really defining what we want out of life. Ultimately, right? It's not going to happen overnight. I think it's important to then also say, like, these are the things I'm willing to give up. And then finally, like, set a roadmap for how you're going to achieve that. And you can, course adjust the whole way through, because you're going to realize, like, hey, maybe I wasn't thinking about this the right way. Maybe I thought I wanted this, but it was actually more this kind of angle that I wanted. You're going to get better resolution as you're down that path, and just have like consistent check-ins and iterate on your vision, and just go after it.
I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing, what was that item that you still desired?
People always ask that. Yeah. It was a pocket knife, which I wanted it. And about 6 months later, I still wanted that. So I got it. It was it was, I don't know why, it was like that one thing that I still wanted. So I felt very confident
a need for it too, right? Like,
sure.
Mm-hmm. Like you can use this. It's not like something that you can use one time or two times and then it's just waste. Like, this is a tool and you can also look at that as an investment too, no matter the cost. I'm curious, when you began kind of like stepping into this lifestyle, what else kind of catapulted from it? Did you begin any homesteading or other ways that you became more minimal? What kind of catapulted from all of this?
Um, I think probably the most visible change other than just living in a tiny house, would be my wardrobe. So when I first started, I wasn't like, a very fashion forward or centric person. But I did have basically two sets of wardrobes. One was like a professional dress for the office, and the other was just like your casual stuff. And when I made this shift to my tiny house, I basically left my corporate job and went to be self-employed. I had been working on that project for a while, and then I finally made the leap. So I basically got rid of my entire professional dress wardrobe, which meant my wardrobe was in half. And then my other wardrobe, I actually took down, and now I wear what I like to call a minimalist uniform. So I have a gray t-shirt that I have 20 of. I have the same undershirt. I have the same shorts and jeans. And I don't ever choose clothes. I just grab whatever's on the top of the pile because they're all the same. So literally my shirts are identical, my shorts are identical, and my pants are identical. And at first I was like, I don't know what people are gonna think about this. And some people were like, oh, that's kind of odd. But then they got used to it and whatever. Um, and it's funny, like I don't think a lot of people even notice that I wear the exact same thing every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure
So I
I'm sure some
mhm,
people when you had that, okay, Ryan, this is weird. That also goes back to living your life based off what other people think or what they think
yeah.
is quote unquote normal. So if you're
Mhm.
okay with it and you're okay with that decision, why else does it matter?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, I think with this too, you have to like kind of calibrate off of like who's the person, right? Is it just some random stranger? Well, I don't care about really, I don't really care about the opinions of some random stranger. Now, if it's something that I'm doing that someone close to me is like, I have a problem with this or whatever, like then I'm going to pay attention and
Right.
consider it. But yeah, I think there's some uncomfortability that comes with breaking some of those standard social norms.
Mm.
And one of them is living in a tiny house. So I had to get over that real quick. The other one is like the clothing choice. But I found that it brought more benefits than negatives. And now it's just so normal for me, and everyone that knows me just like, oh, Ryan's always wearing that gray shirt of his. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a normal. So that would be one other shift
Yeah.
with kind of my lifestyle there.
Yeah. Well, clearly choosing this lifestyle also helped you obtain running a business and not having to live that 9 to 5 life. How did
Mhm.
living in a tiny house really fit into your entrepreneurial journey and how has it aided it along the way?
Yeah. So I think initially, just the reduction of my overhead, right, meant that my runway was extended a lot further. So that basically what that means is my costs dropped dramatically, which meant that the money in my bank could last me longer. And it also meant that as an entrepreneur, I could start out with not making as much as I needed to, or compared to like if I had a house with a mortgage and a car payment and kids and all that kind of stuff. I just didn't have to earn as much initially. And eventually I got there. And actually, by the time that I left my corporate job, I was making more off my entrepreneurial ventures than I was at my day job.
Mm,
But it just made that process a lot less stressful. It made the numbers look a lot more, you know, easier to swallow,
yeah.
and it meant that I could take a few more risks with my business. I could reinvest in the business. And then eventually that led me to be just more satisfied, which meant I was more happy with life. And then that kind of correlated with me earning more. And so I think it just had a really profound effect of my ability to be financially prudent going into an entrepreneurial type of situation.
Mm. I have to ask, have you ever felt stuck in this? Like, oh, now that I'm, part of the tiny house community and I'm teaching others how to do it, have you ever felt like this is all it can be? Or have you felt like this is my passion? I feel good doing this. I don't really see an end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think with this, I really enjoy doing it, and I've broadened what the website covers. So we used to just do tiny houses. Now we focus on tiny houses, minimalism, and homesteading topics. Um, but it's my website, so I can kind of make that decision there. And so that really energizes me. But then it also, because my costs of living are slow, and I talked about taking risks a little bit, I was able to do other businesses as well. So there was I started a conference, ran that for many years. I started a co-working space. We built that up. It was really successful. I ended up selling it. So like it's given me a lot of opportunities to do things, and it keeps my interest. And then if I get bored of it, I can pivot, change it, because it's my own thing and I have the cash to do that.
Yeah, I like how you consistently keep thinking outside of the box too, of like, okay, it doesn't just have to be one thing. It can look however I want it to because I'm in charge of my life.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't want to be contrarian just to be contrarian, but if you're working in the box, like I think it's important to know where the edges of that box is and what are the rules that govern it, and then how you can maximize those rules. In this context, in a legally way, like a good example would be taxes, right? Taxes have a clearly defined box, but as a business owner, there's ways that you can, do your taxes and organize your business and things like that, that will maximize your profits, reduce your tax burden, things like that. So that's the in the box thinking. And we need to be skillful and knowledgeable about how the box works. So when we're in that box, we can maximize it to our benefit. But then I think it's doing ourselves a disservice, whether it's in business or in life, to be confined to that box, because that box is defined by other people to their benefit. And I'm not willing to just sit here and play in their sandbox if it means that I can find opportunity outside to whatever my ends are. So yeah, I think it's really important to think critically about what that kind of box is. Ask critical questions, the hard questions, be willing to take risks, and challenge the status quo a little bit.
Oh, I love it. Challenge the status quo and take risk. That's like what we're here for. And I think that's like what we're always being challenged to do, and to step outside of that box, like you said, and think critically and also think creatively as well, because not a lot of creativity happens in the box. We got to color outside of those lines sometimes to really feel, I think, fully alive and expressive and empowered in what we can do with life.
Yes,
Well,
definitely.
Ryan, I know our audience is just going to want to know more about you and learn more from you. Tell us where they can go to connect with you further.
Sure. So the website is thetinylife.com. And basically from there, you can find all of our socials and everything like that. But the website's the main focus for us. We have over 1,500 articles on all different types of topics of simple living, mainly in tiny houses, minimalism, and homesteading. There's some lifestyle stuff in there too, about goal setting and kind of how to think about defining what you want your life to be. So yeah, that would be the best place to find me, thetinylife.com.
Perfect. Ryan, you are doing this work that's fueled with intention, and you're what I like to call a true world shifter. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ryan is a powerhouse, and I love the tips he shared. I've linked Ryan's website and social channels on this week's episode notes found on mindbizlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, and be sure to leave the podcast a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you tune in and turn it up. I'm back on Friday for another episode of Fuel Your Life Friday. But until then, remember, every level of life is an opportunity to grow. Be well, my friend.